I've just got to say something. A group called Numbers USA is seriously misinforming the public about the actual meaning of this statute and the effect of the real ID. And if you even bother to read their own literature about immigration, they acknowledge that even if all the provisions of the real ID were followed, still 17 of 19 terrorists could have boarded the airplanes on September 11th and did what they did. Only 2 would have been barred. So that would have still left 2 terrorists on an airplane, overtake the pilot. So this is not what some people necessarily think it is, and that group, unfortunately, is misreading. And if there is a response from the state, and this would make the 43rd state, I believe, to what Congress has done, blame Congress, because I'm convinced that the vetting process was somewhat deficient. Why do I say that? We were supposed to be in compliance about a year and a half ago. The Department of Homeland Security has granted to all 56 jurisdictions, states, and territories an extension for compliance. So they didn't get their timetable down correctly here. The statute, and I read the statute, and I read all 135 single-spaced type pages of the regulations recently. The statute talks about identification would be necessary, that they call a real ID, and it's a very slick term, for entry into, quote, federal facilities, boarding federally regulated commercial aircraft, entering nuclear power plants, and this is the catchphrase that has got them in Dutch here, or any purposes that the Secretary shall determine. Is there any limit? I taught grammar to 6th graders. There is no limit on what that means here, folks. This is why you see the response from 42 states saying, we're not going to comply, or we won't comply if you ask for X, Y, and Z, or we want you to amend this. Congress has to blame themselves. How do they do this? They attached a legislative provision, a separate standing bill, to an Appropriations Act that had nothing to do with this. Therefore, a bunch of people can really think about the consequences here. A number of states. Now, nobody is against state governments checking the background and the documents that people submit to see, in fact, if John Smith is, in fact, John Smith, then he applies for a driver's license. As a matter of fact, Congress took what Virginia was doing since 2004 in asking for a birth certificate, a passport, a W-2, or other such documentation to authenticate that indeed an applicant for a driver's license or an ID card is, in fact, who they say they are. So that's not the real problem. So in a certain sense, we are complying with real ID to that extent because, in fact, that law is copying what we were doing here. A number of states have said that they will not be involved with this. The regulations recently acknowledge that, in fact, states will still issue driver's licenses to illegal aliens. So this does not achieve the goal of Numbers USA. And they list 8 states that are doing that. It also says, when I read the regulations, one commentator said he was concerned about the expansion of the definition to include federally licensed firearms dealers and that residents of non-compliant states could be blocked from purchasing firearms. To my shock and horror, DHS did not directly address this concern. What they said is, DHS, and it's on page 5288 of the Federal Register from last year, DHS will continue to consider additional ways in which a real ID license can or should be used, and will implement any changes to the definition of official purpose or determinations regarding additional uses for real ID consistent with applicable laws and regulatory requirements. DHS does not agree that it must seek the approval of Congress as a prerequisite for changing the definition in the future. Now, that is disturbing to me. They don't answer the question, they don't put a denial, they put a dismissal on it. That's not the way to treat American citizens. Again, they may in fact be complying with the statute because Congress, I don't think some of them read this. They talk about if you're not in compliance, and again, all 56 jurisdictions are, you couldn't use a Virginia driver's license or one from Michigan if you're from Michigan to get on an airplane. That's not correct. When you actually read the regulations, they say 25% of the population already holds a valid passport, and the Department of State anticipates this figure will go to 33% in the next few years. Individuals with valid passports do not need to obtain a real ID, as passports are likely to be accepted for the same official purposes, i.e. boarding commercial aircraft. A military ID card will also get you on the airplane. So this is not correct to say that you have to have this. So what is the real purpose of passing this law? This creates more concern, not less. And the only instance, in fact, of a person attempting a terrorist act after 9/11 was in fact from Richard Reed. this terrorist who was flying from Paris, France to Miami. I think it was on a Monday in December, he was denied the ability to board the airplane. Why? Because he was acting strange and he could not answer questions. The next day he came back. He boarded the airplane. You know why he boarded the airplane? He had an authentic, verifiable British passport that properly belonged to him. He was properly identified. He was a proper terrorist. So folks, you know, this is not necessarily the answer what they want to do. Sniffing dogs, chemical analyzers, metal detectors are reasons, or taking your shoes off are more important, I think, than this real ID. Let me read you this here. Domestic violence victims are going to be subject to unfortunate scrutiny and maybe danger because of the Real ID law. A state legislature would not have done this. Why? Because we deal with the application of these things. Congress has no knowledge of this. I'll shorten this. Response. Putting domestic violence victims at jeopardy of their lives or their property or their personal safety because they had some goals that they had up here. That is not the way to treat American citizens. There was another circumstance, says here, I'll just go to the response that DHS has. The Real ID Act does not provide DHS with authority to prohibit third-party private sector uses of the information stored on the Real ID card. DHS is not aware of any current plans by federal agencies to collect and maintain any of the information stored in the MRZ, magnetic reading zone. If a federal agency should decide to use the MRZ to collect and maintain personally identifiable information, any such information collected will be subject to protection of the Privacy Act. It is not necessarily what is going on now with the request from DHS. It is what can happen, what can be authorized, that the real danger is there. So the statute that Senator Cuccinelli and I have says, look, because we are complying with proper security measures to identify people. DHS happens to have those as criteria. If the governor determines, or DHS or Department of Motor Vehicle determines that when they make a request and they can't guarantee the security information, they are not to give that information to any federal agency, and we will go to court over that. That's what this does. So it says, Congress, as long as you don't bother us, we're fine, because we're going to be very prudent in Virginia and issue identification cards properly. But if you can't guarantee the safety of any information, biometric data, they've not asked for a retinal scan, but they could. They've not asked for a fingerprint, but they could. They're not asking for that now. Why? Because they're lulling some people to sleep. And in fact, the response from the states, I think, has gotten the attention of some people in DHS. Why? Because the hub that they want to set up, first, will not be accessed, supposedly, by the federal government. It'll only be accessed by a policeman from Montana checking somebody from a DMV in Missouri. That's a response to the reaction from the states saying, no, hell no, and never to what you want to do with this card. We need to get Congress's attention again, and in Virginia saying, you're not going to compromise our personal security or our personal financial information. So you go up and tell those folks up there to support my bill and Senator Cuccinelli's bill. Thank you very much for coming.
Financial information. So you go up and tell those folks up there to support my bill and Senator Cuccinelli's bill. Thank you very much for coming.